Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that isn't just about swords, shields, or conquest. It's about the hidden edges of desire in a war camp, where every heartbeat can feel like a betrayal, and every glance carries a promise you shouldn't entertain, but totally do anyway. So, settle in, adjust your blanket, and let's wander slowly into the shadows of a campfire-lit night. The camp stretched across the valley like a living map of chaos, rows of tents and half-burned fire pits scattered under the stars. The air smelled of smoke, wet earth, and iron, a combination that never fails to remind soldiers of what they fight for, or what they might lose if they're not careful. Among them, Hamsishli Dausha. Some moved silently between tents. Others laughed a little too loud to mask the exhaustion in their bones, and a few watched, always watching. Then there was Lysandra. She wasn't a soldier, at least not officially, but in her presence, all eyes seemed to bend her way. She moved with purpose, letting the glow of the campfires play against the soft curves of Dengqi Shifa, her face and the hints of silk hidden beneath a coarse cloak. Men whispered, "She's dangerous," though no one could quite say why. There was no sword in her hand, no arrow on her back, and yet, the moment she passed, even the most hardened warriors felt a shift in the air, a tug they couldn't quite name. Across the main fire pit, Marcus, the captain known for a calm hand in battle and a temper that could snap like dry twigs, noticed her too. Not for the first time, mind you. He had always prided himself on being immune to distractions, and yet here she was, walking as if the entire campfire light had been arranged just to frame her. His jaw tightened slightly, not with anger, but with that peculiar sharp sensation. Desire wrapped in caution, a cocktail stronger than any liquor the camp could muster. She approached the fire with a measured grace, hands brushing the brim of her cloak, and for a moment the night seemed to pause. Sparks floated lazily upward from the flames, carrying with them the faint scent of pine and smoke, mingling with the subtle perfume she wore, something warm, earthy, dangerous, like honey laced with smoke. The soldiers around her turned, shifting uneasily under the weight of her presence. Even men who had fought for years across bloodied fields felt an unfamiliar heat creep into their chests. Marcus shifted his position carefully, almost subconsciously, until he was closer to the firelight that kissed her features. He didn't speak. He never had to. The tension between them had been building for days, subtle sparks igniting in stolen glances and almost brushes of hands. As she passed by tents, delivering food or checking on the wounded. And now tonight, the air between them was almost tangible, charged like the prelude to a storm. Her eyes met his, faint smirk curling the edge of her lips. It was a look that promised awareness, that she knew exactly the effect she had, and that she intended to wield it carefully, deliberately. Not carelessly, not recklessly, but with a precision that made every man in the firelight wonder whether they were being tested or baited. Marcus cleared his throat, trying to regain some sense of command over his racing pulse. "You shouldn't be wandering here alone," he said softly, his voice low enough that only she could hear over the crackle of flames. "And miss the fire?" she whispered back, tilting her head, letting the shadowed light skim the delicate curve of her neck. "I think not." It was a statement and a challenge, and Marcus could feel it as a shiver crawling up his spine. This wasn't just attraction. It was strategy. Danger wrapped in silk, tension wrapped in laughter, and desire in its purest, most forbidden form. The kind that could burn a man completely if he let himself get too close. And in that glow, under the flickering firelight, neither of them moved closer. Yet neither could step away. The world beyond the camp faded, leaving only sparks, shadows, and the silent, simmering promise that tonight would not end as it began. The night deepened, dragging the camp into a hush that wasn't quite silence, there was always the crackle of embers, the occasional snort of a tired horse, the distant murmur of men still tending to their postures of vigilance. But between Marcus and Lysandra, the world had contracted into the space around the fire, the small triangle of light that threw dancing shadows across their faces. She leaned slightly forward, not enough to step into him, but enough that the flickering flames highlighted the sharp intelligence in her eyes. There was an ease to her posture, a kind of deliberate calm, as if she had rehearsed these nights, these stolen moments, over and over in her mind. Marcus felt it immediately, the thrill of the unseen risk. Every glance carried a story, every micro-movement a whisper of intent. "米生烧, you're playing with fire," Marcus said quietly, voice low and rough, though he wasn't entirely sure if he meant the literal flames or her presence. Lysandra's smile curved just a fraction, faint but knowing. "And yet here we are," she replied, letting her words hang in the smoke-heavy air like a promise or a warning. He couldn't quite tell which. They both knew the rules. He was a captain, she was a supposed non-combatant, and yet here, under the cover of darkness, those distinctions blurred. Her beauty and confidence were weapons as sharp as any blade, and Marcus, despite himself, was drawn to them, not as a man who sought conquest, but as one who recognized danger in its most delicious form. She shifted, letting a lock of hair fall over her shoulder, brushing ever so slightly against her neck, the movement so innocuous it could be easily ignored. But Marcus didn't. His pulse quickened, a slow, steady burn that made the ache in his chest impossible to hide. Every instinct in him, honed from years of surviving battlefields and betrayals, was now tangled with something far more treacherous. Temptation. Lysandra tilted her head again, catching his gaze fully this time. "Do you ever feel," she asked, voice barely above a whisper, "that the things we crave most are the ones we should never touch?" Marcus swallowed, trying to keep his voice steady. "Every day," he admitted. "And yet, here you are." "King?" Her laugh was soft, barely audible over the crackle of the fire, and it was enough to make the air between them electric. It wasn't teasing, well, maybe a little, but it was also a test. How far could she push him?
No.
How much could he resist before the discipline he prided himself on slipped? For a few moments, they simply watched each other, firelight reflecting in her eyes, highlighting the subtle curve of her lips, the faint shadow of a smile that promised far more than either of them would admit. And the camp seemed oblivious. They were in a bubble, a private theater of tension and temptation, where every movement mattered, and every unspoken word was another step deeper into dangerous territory. Marcus finally broke the gaze, looking down at the fire, letting the heat and the smoke fill the silence between them. "You know," he murmured, more to himself than to her, "if anyone saw us, I'd have to kill them. And if anyone tried to stop us?" Lysandra countered, leaning just a hair closer. Her breath brushed the edge of his shoulder, and Marcus felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because deep down, he knew that this this slow, simmering closeness, this game of shadows and glances, was already too late to resist. Desire had a foothold, and every spark from the fire seemed to fan it higher. Cool. The night stretched on, long and deliberate, and while the camp slept, or pretended to, Marcus and Lysandra remained in that charged bubble of proximity, exploring, testing, and savoring the silent pull between them. No words were needed beyond the glances, no touches beyond what the darkness allowed. But every silent moment was a conversation of its own, and every shadow cast by the fire told a story of temptation, power, and a heat that neither of them could, or wanted to, extinguish. Lalian, the night lingered like a velvet cloak over the camp, soft but heavy, as if even the air were conspiring to keep secrets. Marcus leaned slightly back, careful to maintain the semblance of distance, though the firelight painted Lysandra in hues that made any attempt at restraint laughably futile. Every shadow across her face emphasized the sharpness in her eyes, the quiet confidence of someone who knew precisely the effect she had on those around her. Cerise. She moved just enough to stretch her fingers toward the edge of the fur beside her, a subtle shift that might have been incidental, if not for the way her gaze never left his. Marcus felt it immediately. A slow, deliberate tightening in his chest, the kind that had nothing to do with exertion or strategy and everything to do with the woman before him. "You always think you can resist," Lysandra murmured, voice low, teasing and dangerous all at once. "But some things choose you, don't they?" Marcus's jaw tightened. He wanted to respond with authority, with the disciplined control he wielded in battle after battle. Shipanzipol managed arrest. Instead, he only managed arrest. "You're tempting me, am I?" she said, and her smile was a weapon, subtle but lethal. The corner of her mouth curved just enough to promise danger without committing. Quirp. She leaned just slightly closer, and Marcus felt the warmth brush him. An almost imperceptible contact, but enough to ignite the slow burn building in his veins. Around them, the camp breathed, oblivious to the danger of desire playing out in plain sight. Every man asleep, every soldier lulled by fatigue, was irrelevant. Here, the stakes were intimate, private, and infinitely more perilous. A single misstep could ruin him, or worse, them both. Lysandra's eyes softened for a fraction of a second, just enough to suggest a tenderness beneath the heat. Marcus noticed it, and that split-second hesitation was all it took for the tension to become nearly unbearable. She was daring him to act, daring him to break the invisible boundary between self-control and surrender. "I've survived worse than temptation," Marcus admitted, though his voice wavered just slightly, betraying the truth he'd hoped to hide. "But you make it difficult." She tilted her head, her hair brushing the edge of her shoulder again, teasing him silently. "Difficult," she repeated, almost a whisper. "Or impossible?" "To?" The question hung in the smoke-thick night, a challenge as old as time, as old as desire itself. Marcus's pulse raced, not just from the physical nearness, not just from the smell of her hair and the warmth of her presence, but from the unspoken game they were entwined in, a dance of power, restraint, and raw temptation that neither could, or wanted to, ignore. His fingers itched, barely restrained, and he forced himself to glance away, focusing instead on the dancing embers of the fire. Yet even that attempt at composure failed, because every flicker of light drew his attention back to her. Every shadow seemed to tease him. Every subtle smile whispered of dangerous pleasures he wasn't supposed to indulge in. Lysandra's laugh was soft, barely a sound over the crackle of the fire, but it was enough to make his chest tighten further. "You worry too much, Captain," she said, voice dripping with mischief. "Sometimes the best strategy is to surrender." And in that moment, Marcus knew, with a clarity that was both thrilling and terrifying, that surrender was exactly what he wanted. But in this war of glances, whispers, and silent promises, it wasn't a decision to be taken lightly. Every step closer was a gamble, every touch unspoken but felt, and the edge they teetered on was as sharp as any blade in his arsenal. The night stretched on, and the fire dwindled to glowing coals, but neither Marcus nor Lysandra moved away. Their eyes held the conversation, their breaths spoke the dialogue, and the camp, sleeping or pretending to, remained oblivious to the slow, simmering war of temptation waging in its midst. The fire had burned low, leaving only a few stubborn embers that cast flickering light across the edges of the tent. Marcus could feel the heat from the coals, but it was nothing compared to the warmth emanating from Lysandra mere inches away. He told himself it was the strategic proximity, that he needed to maintain watchful control, but deep down he knew the truth. The closeness was a battlefield of its own. She shifted, brushing her hand ever so lightly against his arm, not enough to draw a sound, but enough to send a shiver that traveled straight to his chest. Marcus's eyes narrowed, his mind racing with rules, discipline, and everything he should be considering, yet every fiber of his being ignored caution. "You're tense," she murmured, voice soft, intimate, and slightly teasing. "Do you always command your soldiers this strictly, or am I special?" Marcus tried to suppress the shudder her words elicited, but he failed. "You have a dangerous talent for noticing weaknesses," he admitted, his voice low, almost a growl betraying the control he had fought to maintain. Lysandra leaned closer, not threateningly, not overtly, but in a way that demanded attention. Her breath was faint against his ear, the warmth a subtle provocation. "And I suppose that's why you can't look away," she whispered. Friction to censure, letting the tiniest trace of amusement curl in her tone. He swallowed hard. The line between discipline and desire was thinning with every second, every flicker of her gaze. Marcus's fingers flexed against his knees, the urge to bridge the distance almost unbearable. In another time, another place, another war, this would have been an act of recklessness. Here, it was simply unavoidable. She tilted her head, her hair brushing the side of her face in a way that made him acutely aware of every inch of exposed skin. "I wonder," she said softly, "how far you'll let yourself go before the world intrudes." Marcus' pulse thundered in his ears. He knew the dangers, every soldier, every shadow beyond the tent flap, every rumor waiting to erupt. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Lysandra was a force of nature, subtle and undeniable, and he was caught in the current. Her hand lingered a fraction longer than necessary on his arm. A breach of proximity so slight it could be dismissed, or remembered forever. Marcus did remember. Every nerve ending screamed with the temptation to close the gap, to cross the boundary he had so carefully maintained. "I don't like losing control," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, as if saying it louder might shatter the delicate tension between them. "Then perhaps you should surrender," she replied, the words so quiet they were almost intimate secrets shared in a confessional, yet charged with promise. Kungal, outside the tent, the camp slept, oblivious to the quiet war of wills inside. Inside, Marcus and Lysandra existed in a realm where strategy met desire, where every glance, every touch, every whispered word was an act of seduction and subterfuge. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to look away from her eyes, but even then, the firelight caught the curve of her lips, the shadow of her cheek, the slightest tilt of her head, and he felt the pull, the inevitable draw toward her, that he had no intention of resisting. In that quiet, flickering space, Marcus realized that some battles weren't fought with swords. Some were fought with whispers, with lingering touches, with shared breaths, Eshawok, and tonight, that was a war he was willing to lose. Part Wu, the first forbidden touch, Kaino, the night deepened, and with it, the shadows within the tent stretched and danced across canvas walls. Marcus's control, which had seemed so steady earlier, began to fracture under the relentless proximity of Lysandra. Every subtle movement, every whisper, felt magnified, charged with an electricity neither dared name aloud. She leaned slightly forward, just enough for her fingers to graze his hand. As she reached for the wine flask, the contact was almost imperceptible, a fleeting brush, yet it sent a tremor through his body. Marcus clenched his jaw, trying to mask the effect, trying to remind himself that the camp outside was filled with eyes, ears, and dangers he could not afford to ignore. "Bond, you feel it too," she murmured, her voice a soft, teasing drawl, a whisper that seemed meant only for him. "Don't pretend otherwise." Marcus's hand twitched involuntarily, inching closer, not to touch, but simply to acknowledge the magnetic pull between them. "I don't indulge distractions," he said, though the edge in his tone betrayed him. Melisandre smiled faintly, her eyes glinting with mischief and something warmer, more dangerous. She moved again, this time letting her hand rest lightly on the back of his, the silk of her sleeve brushing against his skin. It was deliberate, a challenge wrapped in elegance, and Marcus felt the fire in his chest flare. Careful," he warned, though his voice was tight with restraint. "You're treading into perilous territory." "No, and yet you stay," she replied softly, leaning just a fraction closer, until the warmth of her shoulder pressed against his arm. "Perhaps you'll like the danger as much as I do." Marcus's pulse quickened. Every rational thought screamed at him to pull away, to maintain command and discipline. But the pull was irresistible. He could feel her breath near his cheek, soft, measured, and utterly intimate. Each exhale brushing against his skin like a silk ribbon against metal armor. Then their fingers brushed again, more boldly this time. Marcus did not withdraw. Instead, he allowed the connection, brief as it was, to anchor him in the moment. The outside world, the soldiers, the campfires, the looming threats, faded into irrelevance. All that mattered was the silent conversation of touches, glances, and whispers that filled the tent. "Mondi, you know," Lysandra said, letting her voice drop to a near-humming whisper. "We could lose ourselves entirely in this, and no one would ever know." Marcus swallowed, tension coiling tight in his chest. The words were a dare, an invitation, and he recognized the gravity of yielding. Tishiv. Yet the ache for contact, the temptation of proximity, gnawed at him relentlessly. "I'm aware," he murmured, his voice low, almost ragged, and yet, "every moment I resist is another moment I'm tempted beyond reason." Lysandra's lips curved in that subtle, provocative smile. He had come to both dread and crave. "Then perhaps," she whispered, "resistance is futile." For the first time that night, their hands fully intertwined, a brief but electric brush of fingers that ignited something neither could deny. The contact was fleeting, tentative, yet it carried the weight of unspoken desires, a bridge between command and surrender, between danger and indulgence. Marcus leaned back slightly, heart racing, aware of the peril in their proximity, yet powerless to stop the intoxicating allure of her presence. Outside the tent, the camp remained oblivious, and inside, the boundaries of control and temptation blurred, leaving only the raw, palpable tension of a war waged in whispers, touches, and the unspoken promise of what was yet to come. The night carried on, heavy and warm, with the muted crackle of embers from the distant campfire, seeping faintly through the canvas walls. Inside the tent, the air was thick with the scent of smoke, wine, and something far more dangerous, anticipation. Marcus and Lysandra sat closer now, the brief contact of their hands lingering longer than propriety allowed, each heartbeat marking the rhythm of unspoken temptation. "You shouldn't," Marcus murmured, his tone low, taut with a friction of restraint, yet his eyes betrayed him, betraying the hunger he tried to mask. "And yet I am here," Lysandra whispered back, leaning in so that her hair brushed his shoulder, a deliberate, tantalizing brush. 比去to Glibrian, 发是样身息头绳, to partial tension. "Are you telling me you enjoy this tension, Marcus?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "You make it impossible to think clearly." He reached subtly, just enough to let his fingertips graze hers, feeling the heat of her skin through the fine fabric. Each brush sent shivers up his spine, a warning and a lure all at once. Lysandra smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of lips that spoke of secrets and knowledge. He wasn't sure he wanted to resist. "Perhaps I do," she said softly, "because watching you struggle with it. It's delightful." The distance between them closed imperceptibly. Her breath brushed against his neck, warm and intoxicating, drawing a tremor he couldn't suppress. Door. The silk of her sleeve slid slightly, exposing just a hint of pale skin, and Marcus's restraint wavered dangerously. "I should stop," he whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Before everything unravels." "Canned? Or we could see what happens when control slips," Lysandra countered, her lips almost grazing the shell of his ear, whispering words that made the fine hairs on his neck stand on end. Just a taste, nothing more, just enough to remember. Their hands met fully now, fingers entwined with deliberate intent. Marcus felt the electric pull of her warmth, the subtle, magnetic pressure of her body leaning into his, and realized the truth. This was no longer a game of restraint. Each touch, each brush of skin, carried the weight of desire, danger, and daring, a combustible mix that could ignite at any moment. Lysandra shifted slightly, so that her knee brushed his leg, a gentle, provocative contact that spoke louder than words ever could. "You're a soldier," she said, almost teasingly, "trained to command, to conquer, to control. And yet here, in this tent, you are powerless." Marcus exhaled sharply, a mix of frustration and longing. "I am not powerless," he said, though the heat in his chest betrayed him, "but I have never faced an adversary like you." "And yet," she murmured, eyes gleaming in the dim light, "you don't resist me entirely." The tension between them reached a crescendo, the air charged with a potent mixture of anticipation and restraint. Marcus's fingers brushed the nape of her neck lightly, testing, hesitating, tasting the moment without overstepping, and Lysandra tilted her head, granting the smallest permission with a sigh, soft, almost inaudible, yet more intoxicating than any wine. Outside, the camp slumbered, oblivious to the flames building behind canvas walls. Inside, the war was different, waged not with swords or strategies, but with whispered provocations, electric touches, and the dangerous allure of surrendering to desire. The first forbidden contact had been made, and neither could retreat without losing something vital, something thrilling, something unbearably hot. And as Marcus leaned just slightly closer, the tent closing in around them, it became clear. Nothing in the battlefield could match the intensity of this silent, seductive war.